Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be taking part in your seminar series this afternoon. My name is Aggie Hirst. I am a reader, which translates in the US lingo to associate prof in international relations theory and methods in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I'm delighted to be talking to you today, particularly a group of people who are already interested in and enthusiastic about wargames. I have been undertaking research with the US military wargaming community of practice over the last 7 years or so, and I'm just wrapping up a book which has the same title of my talk today. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the topic of the politics of play wargaming with the US military. So as you will be well aware, we are well into what's been called a gaming revolution. Some have called our current epoch the ludic century. We are living in the time of the digital native, a group of people who are kind of born and raised on digital artifacts and culture. And of course, we've seen widespread gamification across a whole bunch of sectors, including recreation and leisure, child and adult education, various forms of training, commercial and advertising applications, and my own particular interest, military gaming. Oops, I've gone too far forward. So politics of play, wargaming with the US military. This has been my main research project since 2017. I've been lucky enough to get a couple of grants to conduct this research from the Leverhulme Trust and from the British Academy. And I've managed to accrue over the intervening period around 100 hours of interview data with the US military wargaming community of practice. That is the professional wargamers who are in and around the US Department of Defense and US military. So what am I trying to do with this project? I have two kind of broad interventions I'm seeking to make. As my job title suggests, I'm a scholar in international relations. And so what I'm trying to do first and foremost is move the focus of international relations away from the kind of recreational and leisure gaming questions towards a focus on military gaming. Now, this topic really is under-researched in the field, as I'm sure many of you are aware. We've had a flurry of literature looking at video games, looking at role-playing games, looking at the leisure and recreational side of gaming, hobby gaming, if you will. But military gaming remains really under-researched. So I'm trying to effect a shift in that direction. What I'm also trying to do is introduce the study of play to international relations. Whilst we have this nascent literature on leisure and recreational gaming, we don't really have a kind of accompanying theorization of play. And I think that's a real oversight for reasons I'll go into in this talk. For my money, you can't really understand too much about games unless you know a bit about play. I've published a number of articles on this topic as kind of precursor work to this book project. They've come out with International Studies Quarterly, with with Review of International Studies, with Critical Military Studies, and with International Political Sociology, working on a one that's just been accepted to Security Dialogue, and of course the kind of pièce de résistance, politics of play, wargaming with the US military, that will be coming out with Oxford University Press end of this year, early next, she says, crossing her fingers. So what am I doing in this book? The key questions that I'm asking here: how does military gaming work? How are games used through the life cycle of warfighters, and what are the effects of this use? I'm trying to develop this idea of play as pedagogy, that play is actually a very powerful learning tool for reasons that I will elaborate upon. But I also kind of want to ask a critical question. What are the politics of harnessing play for military purposes? We usually think of play as something associated with maybe children, maybe animals, maybe our downtime, our leisure time. It's not serious, it's not political. But how and why and with what kind of implications is it being harnessed in the use of war games for military purposes? So what I try and do in the book is think seriously about what drives play. And I try to elucidate, first of all, the role of victory conditions in driving play. As we know, people play to win, but of course they don't stop when they win. What I want to argue is that somehow the pursuit of victory conditions can turn gaming into what I call a perpetual motion machine that actually is a very powerful learning tool precisely because there is no resolution that comes with a particular win or a particular victory or the end of a particular game. Secondly, I'm very fascinated really by the question of immersion. Where do we go when we play, as one of my very insightful colleagues put it in a conference discussion once. So I want to argue that what happens when we get immersed is that some of our more reflexive capacities become suspended. We become one with what we're doing. We have an experience of something that people have called chronoslip, where time becomes rather different to its usual flow. So I want to explore the politics of these phenomena, the pursuit of victory conditions, and this state of immersion. I argue in the book, and my broad conclusion really is that it matters much less what we play than how we play. Much like when we think about other cultural artifacts, I'm very interested in thinking about how to cultivate a kind of critical and reflexive play style, which breaks with the kind of suspended and somewhat sort of hazy immersion state, and rather brings critical thinking, critical reflection into our gaming and playing lives. What I do in order to advocate for that position is I offer a kind of retheorization of play, actually really in international relations, the first fully developed theory of play. I build on Sparios's distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian play to offer a kind of third way, a kind of retheorization, which I call deconstructive play, which is grounded in the thought of Jacques Derrida. So there's a heavy theory component in addition to the concrete empirics, and I'll be happy to elaborate on either one in greater detail if I don't go through it to your satisfaction of interest in the talk. So the book is structured in the following way. It begins with chapters that contextualize wargaming and conceptualize it. Of course, as we know, there is something of a kind of conceptual quagmire. What is a war game? How does it sit in relation to simulations and exercises? How does it relate to video games and all the rest of it? So I spend a full chapter trying to work through what a wargaming is, isn't, how it relates to these other artifacts. I talk a bit about the various forms of gaming that go on in the military across the different ranks, across different spheres, such as training, teaching, analysis, and so on. Just to sort of try to be as clear as possible about what I'm talking about in the rest of the book. The second chapter tries to trace the origins of what's been called a wargaming renaissance that begins in 2014 with DoD-wide memos coming out of the Deputy Defense and Defense Secretary's office, really calling for a renewed and revivified wargaming initiative across DoD. So I try in that chapter to talk a bit about the place of games in international relations and a kind of elided history there, drawing in part on the work of the brilliant John Emery, whose work I recommend to you if you haven't read it already. And I then proceed to explore the kind of official moving and shaking that kind of brought this resurgence into existence in the kind of mid to late 20-teens. From there, I take a fairly significant jump. So the first two chapters are more empirically grounded. The third and fourth are much more theoretically oriented. What I'm trying to do is, first of all, construct a genealogy of play from the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus in particular, through to the modern phenomenologists. As I said, I have a theory background, so I quite enjoy a deep dive into the sort of philosophical side of things. But I don't do this simply for my own interest. I do it because, as I said at the beginning, I think a thorough and detailed understanding of play is going to be really crucial to understanding what wargaming is and what wargaming and how wargaming works. So having set up and traced this genealogy of play, looking at this Apollonian and Dionysian kind of interrelation through the ancient to modern periods, I then turn to the postmodern period and I think about Jacques Derrida, and I use his work to elaborate on this idea of deconstructive play. What I want to suggest with deconstructive play is that really, as I said before, it matters much more how we play. I try to use this idea of playing deconstructively to think about what kinds of messages are coded into games. What are the assumptions? What are the power relations and hierarchies? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? I try to think about play as an active and reflexive exercise rather than something that is more sort of, I don't know, detached and passive. So I try to cultivate this idea of deconstructive play in that segment. Returning then to more empirical matters, I then trace two ways in which I think gaming works. The first of which is producing realities, and the second of which is producing people, in this case, warfighters. I try and show how wargaming has effects both on the political world around us and on the players who play them in particular ways. And I also argue that those power relations and those productive hyperreal properties haven't really been thoroughly enough explored in the existing literature. So I try to contribute a deep dive into that. Finally, as I say, I turn to these questions of the winning condition, the imperative to win, and the politics of immersion, thinking of these as the kind of drivers that keep gamers gaming, keep wargaming in motion. And I think about both how winning creates this perpetual motion machine, or at least the pursuit of victory conditions. Of course, as we know, the realization of a win state isn't necessarily the purpose of any given game. And then I think about this idea of immersion and flow, and try to think about it politically as well. What does it mean to teach and train people in an immersed state if their reflexive capacities have been reduced? What does it mean to think about a flow state as a kind of ideal state of being? I try and think about the political context in which that was proffered as a political kind of option. So that's the broad overview. I don't know if anyone's popped any questions in the chat, but I'm really happy to keep an eye on that as we go. If anyone wants me to elaborate on anything as we go along, I'd be very happy to. So I'll keep that link open. So starting at the beginning then, I'll breeze through this because I know you folks are already familiar. What is a war game? As we know, there is an enormous lack of consensus in the professional community of practice, differing views on whether or not sims and games are one and the same, different views on whether or not manual or digital games are superior, different views about whether commercial games should be used in the military or whether the military should really be producing its own gaming artifacts. Someone is saying enormous lack of consensus. That's the understatement of the year. I couldn't agree more. As I say, I've interviewed a lot of people and I don't think any two accounts have been the same in all of those interviews. So it's been quite interesting to see quite how varied the assumptions and opinions are in that, which is one of the reasons I spend so much time in chapter 1 trying to disaggregate that sort of conceptual quagmire. Of course, as we know, different games are used for different purposes. We have product and process oriented games. Are we interested in cultivating skills or particular abilities or particular training, or are we trying to generate kind of synthetic experience, more open-ended and exploratory forms of gaming? And of course, there are variations across research, teaching, training. But one of the statements and one of the arguments I make in the book is that actually all games teach people something. I actually want to sort of contest the idea that research and educational training games are kind of, qualitatively all that different. I borrow Ralph Costa's statement here, his notion that all games are edutainment, because I really believe that everybody is left with something, right, after a war game, even if it's a research-focused game. The game has taught you something. You are not quite the same person after the game as you were before. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we think about the kind of hyper-real productive properties of gaming. So, of course, all these different kinds of games obtain. We've had debates and criticisms and pearl clutching responses to some issues surrounding things like America's Army. We see games, being used in a whole host of contexts across the military. So I began this project in 2017, and what I was told in those early interviews was that really a renaissance was underway, and this had begun in 2014 when Bob Work and Chuck Hagel, who were Deputy Defense and Defense Secretary respectively, had circulated these DoD-wide memos really calling for a renewed focus on wargaming. Sorry, Daniel, the book I'm referring to is the one I'm talking about today. So it's the book I'm about to publish called Politics of Play, Wargaming with the US Military. So that is going to be out hopefully later this year, early next. So I'm just giving a kind of overview really of the content of the book. Thanks for your question. Okay, so the kind of key areas that I focused, or that were focused on, among others, in the DoD-wide memos, were things like weapons and vehicle training, kind of operational and tactical level things, of course, strategic and doctrine gaming, things like language and cultural sensitivity, and of course, in an area that's actually still quite understudied relative to others, gaming has been identified as of use in rehabilitation and therapeutic purposes. So this was one of the most surprising things that came out of my research on this. The gaming is actually used really across the life cycle of service members. Of course, it's used pre-deployment in the sphere of recruitment and strategic communication. It's used in all kinds of ways during service and deployment, whether it's on downtime, trying to pass the time on deployment, whether it's on base, in barracks, and so on. And of course, it's used quite extensively post-deployment. I ended up talking with a bunch of very interesting US military veterans, one of whom, in fact, told me that gaming saved his life. And what he meant by that was that gaming allowed him to rebuild communities, rebuild his life, and really find a way of managing some of the trauma and PTSD symptoms he was suffering following his return from Iraq. That introduced me to a whole bunch of people. I don't know if people are aware of the group Stack Up. You can see some dudes in a red t-shirt there at a gaming convention wearing them. But Stack Up is a kind of charity which provides gaming care packages for physically and mentally wounded service members on deployment and post-service as well. And so I think it's been very interesting to identify how gaming works in this kind of cycle from the very beginning, in fact, before service begins, right through to when people are leaving service and recovering from injury and so on. So through the course of the interviews, I've been asking people to kind of identify why they think that we should be using wargaming in the US military. What are its benefits? What are its limitations? People frequently identify things like it being cost effective. Makes good sense. If you do something in a game or a simulation, you don't have to use live rounds, you don't have to reset hardware, you don't have to get people out in the field and so on. That makes it, of course, replicable. You can try the same game, the same scenario, the same simulation, many times over. And of course, it's safe to fail. Nobody gets hurt in a game. They say also, of course, that it draws on the skills and interests of the digital native generation. If you want to kind of encourage people to engage seriously with their training, using gaming media can be quite useful, so say the community of practice. They also argue that gaming has the capacity to really increase attention and retention. Rather than sitting in a lecture or having someone talk at you in the way that I'm doing right now, if you can learn through a game, then people's attention is increased and they tend to retain information more. Again, studies that actually prove this are quite limited, but anecdotally, people in the community are fairly convinced of this. It also, I think, quite importantly, introduces questions of fun and enjoyment into a training environment, which can otherwise be very grueling. Again, capitalizing on existing skill sets, but also existing associations with pleasure, with enjoyment, with enthusiasm. And it has multiple side benefits too. Some forms of games and exercises are used for diplomatic purposes. They're used to boost unit cohesion. They have a number of transferable skills, both kind of physical, physiological, psychological, and so on. But there are in the literature some slightly more perhaps concerning accounts of what wargaming can do, and I've been quite interested to kind of push at these and see what people have meant. So James Paul Gee talks about the ways in which gaming can, quote, offload some of the cognitive burden. Now that seems quite troubling in some ways. What does it mean to offload the cognitive burden? That means somehow to perhaps kind of get people to do things without cognitively sort of processing it. So that might have some kind of ethical or normative questions associated. He also talks about this idea of performance before competence. Well, what does that mean? Performance before competence, that suggests that you do something before you really know how to do it or are fully cognizant of how it works. Again, when we think about teaching and training, especially in a military context, I think these are questions that we need to put a little bit under the microscope. So the research has brought up Bloom's taxonomy of learning domains quite frequently. Many in the wargaming community use Bloom's taxonomy to kind of illustrate how wargaming teaches people and why it's an effective teaching and training tool. And I think the following remark by Roman and Brown is quite interesting. They argue that wargaming is a cost-effective means to provide experience-based learning with an emphasis on cognitive and increasingly affective training domains. Now, I use this little diagram here just to give a kind of sense, really, of some of the kind of human faculties or attributes with which these two domains are associated. The cognitive domain, as you won't be surprised to hear, I'm sure, has to do with the kind of capacities we have for comprehension, analysis, evaluation. It's about recollection, synthesis of information. It's about sort of thinking, if you will. Whereas the affective domain, sorry, I should say, is much more kind of emotionally based. It has to do with attitudes, feelings, motivations, values, and these sorts of things. So I found it very interesting in the course of the interviews to be seeing that wargaming is really viewed not just of use in the cognitive domain, but also in this more affective sort of human dimension element as well. So why use wargaming? What I've tried to sort of draw out of this big sort of wedge of interviews that I did, as I said, I accrued about 100 hours in the end between 2017 and 2019, was really trying to draw out kind of, is there a consensus? What is it broadly in the military that people think wargamings can and should be used for? And what might this not sufficiently have kind of, what kinds of other things might be ignored in this view? So the military view, as I understand it, goes something like the following. Games are useful in the military because you can kind of code in particular learning objectives. You do that, you form victory conditions that help people pursue those learning objectives, and that's really the purpose, right? You don't game in the military for fun, you don't do it as an end in itself, but you game in order to teach or train or research something. So there's a goal or an objective that's coded in towards which players are encouraged. The realization of these objectives, whether they're learning or analysis or whatever it is the kind of criterion of success, right? And so what people oftentimes seek is a kind of deeper and more long-lasting immersive play state by suspending people in what we might call a kind of flow or immersion state in order to kind of realize these learning objectives. Now, there is some disagreement in the community of practice around the importance of immersion and also exactly what immersion is. Some have talked a bit about how there might be multiple immersions. Some forms of immersion, they're generated with very high-tech kind of gadgetry, bells, whistles, digital stuff, AR and VR and so on. But some also argue that immersion can just as easily and perhaps even more powerfully be generated in analog games, tabletop, seminar and so on, because it involves more of a sort of imaginative leap. So what I do in the book is try to kind of tease apart and identify these different forms of immersion that might be at work. But broadly speaking, the military view tends to focus on efficacy, right? Are gamings useful? How can we use them to realize certain objectives across teaching, training, research, and so on? But my question is, what does this ignore? And my answer to that question is really it doesn't engage with the politics of using play in the pursuit of military ends. It oftentimes doesn't ask the question of how wargaming teaches and trains military personnel and the effects that it has on them. As I say, one of the things I want to draw out in the book is this idea of a tension between immersion and agency, that when we are immersed, we are not fully reflexive, we are not fully using our critical faculties. And what does it mean to teach people under conditions of that sort of suspension of the kind of critical faculties that we have? So as I said at the beginning, if anyone wants to pose any questions as I go along, please do. I'll be more than happy to respond as we go. So wargaming is pedagogy. I really think if you're going to understand how wargaming works as a teaching tool, you can't really stop just with the game. You've got to expand your analysis to the phenomenon of play. And so I think, and the more I think about this, the more I think I'm convinced of it, that not only are play and game not one and the same, of course we play games, we use the language of play to describe what we do when we game. But I actually think they are very different. And I think in some ways, in fact, they are actually opposed to one another. They sit in tension with one another. Now, this is because play is a kind of exploratory human capacity or ability. As we know, when children play, they sort of make and break rules as they go along. They can kind of, it's a self-governed and self-authored sort of space. I'm thinking of sort of free play here rather than what we might call gameplay. Whereas a game is actually a system or a structure which apprehends and directs play. Play, if you like, is the kind of energy that brings the game to life. But in so doing, the game actually apprehends, limits, and sort of deploys play in the service of its ends. So while play is kind of open-ended and kind of rhizomatic, to use a Deleuzian and Catarian kind of image, a game is oftentimes much more structured. It has to do with rules, has to do with accepting a certain amount of externally imposed direction in that sense. Of course, one could create a game oneself and play it, but I would suggest that's more play than a game as we would ordinarily understand it. But of course, then there are things that fall in between, things like role-playing games. I think blur the line here quite interestingly, things like LARPing. On the one hand, they involve rules. On the other hand, they're very much self-directed, and those rules can be modified and explored differently. So in the case of using games as teaching tools, I wager that we are harnessing play for particular pedagogical ends. As I said before, games are always designed and they are selected for some purpose or aim or objective in the military context. And that's also true in civilian teaching contexts as well. So what I argue in the book, among other things, is that all war games teach their players, whether they are intended as an education game or not. So I do want to challenge that conventional distinction between education and analytic or experimental gaming. So why do we need to understand play? Isn't play simply frivolous or juvenile? Children play, animals play, we play on our downtime. It seems unserious, right? Mechthild Nagel uses a rather more philosophical description. She says that that there has been a malediction of play in Western philosophy through the modern period, really since Socrates and Plato, because play is seen as the sort of opposite of reason. It's seen as the opposite of seriousness, of science, of sobriety. It's seen as kind of frivolous and pointless, apolitical and consequenceless. But scholars interested in play explain that it is, in fact, in many different ways, really vital for life. They argue that it's really an essential category of existence. It's how we grow, it's how we learn, it's how we socialize. One of my favorite quotes from a psychologist, Brown, I think his name is that play is what makes life lifey. And I don't think that's a particularly sort of scientific way of putting it, but I think affectively it makes a good deal of sense. He argues that without play, life is just survival. And he says that the opposite of play isn't seriousness. Actually, the opposite of play is depression. It's kind of withdrawal. It's a loss of that vitality and liveliness. But when you start to study play, you realize that it's an extremely slippery thing to get a hold of, much more difficult even than trying to figure out the conceptual confusions around war games, simulations, exercises, and so on. And it's complicated ontologically, it's complicated in a whole bunch of ways. It's both truth and illusion, it's both real and non-real, it's a phenomenon and also a form of subjectivity. What I do in the book in order to try to unravel this very kind of complicated question of play is really trace it through the Western philosophical tradition. So I start off with this idea of Dionysian play, which begins with Heraclitus, the play of the Greek gods, the play of the kind of unbounded and kind of anarchic kind of pre-Socratic world, which of course comes back to bear when we see Nietzsche challenge sort of metaphysics and philosophy later on. But essentially I borrow Spariosu's idea that there is this kind of Apollonian and Apollonian mode and a Dionysian mode. The Dionysian is associated with this kind of anarchic play, whereas the Apollonian is associated with order, with reason, with all of these other kinds of things. So I try to draw this distinction out and critically evaluate it, really starting back with the ancients and going all the way through to the modern period. Then, of course, I move on to the postmodern period, about which I'll say a little bit more in a moment. So in the Apollonian play mode, what we really see is the kind of primacy of reason over play. If we read Kant, if we read Plato or Aristotle, if we look at the other German idealists, we really see this phenomenon of a kind of malediction of play in modern Western philosophy. Peter is saying, I still have PTSD from Gadamer's Truth and Methods. Well, thank you. I'm glad you're impressed I was able to bring hermeneutics into wargaming. I mean, you know, we'll see what people make of it when the thing is eventually published. But it's some heavy reading has taken place. I certainly agree with you there. I think if you can manage Derrida, then you can just about manage Gadamer. I think that takes you know, a lot of late nights and a lot of coffee for sure. So yes, really what you see in this tradition, in the Apollonian tradition, is the idea that play is frivolous, that it's in opposition to reason, that it's a kind of hindrance to learning and to science and to the Enlightenment and so on. So as Spariosu puts it, For Kant, the explicit goal of the first critique of pure reason is to replace the mere play of imagination and thought with the seriousness of scientific investigation. Now, this is, of course, juxtaposed with Dionysian play. And this really advocates the primacy of play over reason. So it sort of inverts that binary. And it's associated with both the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus, but also the post-idealists like Nietzsche. And in this, the argument goes that far from play being subordinate to reason, actually play subordinates reason to aesthetics. Really, play is a dance between creativity and nihilism. As Nietzsche puts it, the maturity of man, that means to have reacquired the seriousness that one had as a child at play. So I think this sort of tension, and Megfield Nagel goes into this in some detail, that there is this kind of very interesting tension in the Western philosophical tradition, that neither one of these traditions ever manages to win out, right? It's like a dialectical back and forth, which keeps the one pushing at the other and vice versa. But what I think we can certainly take forward philosophically and also in the context, the empirical context of wargaming, is that play is by no means frivolous. That play is in fact serious business. And we know this from our own experience, right? We know this from what it feels like to play. If we think back to being children, if we think about the kind of games that we play and the kind of play, the ways that we play with games, rather than simply just following the win state in a game, we are never more serious than when we play. If you think of the concentration and the focus that people have at play, it's a very powerful state. So play can be understood as a behavior, an action, a motivation, an attitude, an experience, and an existential condition. It's a very powerful form of communication, but also a very powerful form of meta-communication. What I mean by that, and I borrow this from Bateson, I should say, is that play doesn't only tell us what it's doing, it tells us about what it's telling us that it's doing. It has a sort of meta component there. And Bateson explores this in the play of wolf cubs. He says, if you look at wolf cubs play, not only do they play and communicate to each other in their play, but they also communicate to each other that the play is play. As he puts it, this nip, when one nips another on its ear, is not a bite. It's not a serious bite, it's a play bite. And we know of examples, we can think of examples, I think, in our own kind of play experiences, where we demonstrate that what we're doing is not the serious version of itself. If we're playing, I don't know, Transformers, as I did as a kid, or Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, you know, you're not actually trying to, you know, kick or punch one another. You are meta-communicating the play of the action as you go along. Play is, of course, highly absorbing. It is what's called autotelic, which means that it is really for its own sake. It's not for the sake of something else. Now, of course, that sits in contrast to games, as I said, which have a purpose, have an objective, have a kind of end state in mind, particularly in the military context. When we're at play, we are oftentimes sort of self-forgetful. We're focused really intensely on what we're doing, and it exists, of course, in its own spatial and temporal zone. It's both in and outside reality, and it has this self-renewing desire to continue. But of course, as we know, play, while an end in itself, when done spontaneously, can also be harnessed for extrinsic ends. You can attach purposes and goals to play, particularly when that play is harnessed in the form of a game. So I will begin to draw things to a close. I think I have about 10 minutes left. How does wargaming teach using play then? Let's bring this discussion of play back to the question of wargaming. And this is what, as I say, I spend the final 2 chapters of the book really fleshing out. Well, the first way that wargaming teaches using play is through this deployment of the pursuit of victory conditions, this idea that you play for the win. It's interesting when you talk to the military community of practice, the professional wargaming community, they are very insistent that players must play to win. If a game is going to be successful, if it's going to be valid, if it's going to be useful, you can't have people not really caring, not really trying. People have to pursue the victory conditions. Now, of course, getting an end state, realizing a win, is almost always not the point. It doesn't matter if you actually win or lose, but you have to try to win. And they argue that it's, you know, that's human nature, right? Nobody likes to lose, and particularly in the context of the military, military is really, winning is very key to sort of military socialization, military values, and so on. One of the things that came out of the interviews, though, that I found very interesting is that winning is oftentimes framed as a kind of natural or spontaneous sort of property that humans have. But it's also interesting to think about how it has to be continuously cultivated, whether in our broader culture, whether through gamification, and so on. And I think it's worth asking ourselves the question, do we naturally play to win, or do we naturally play to play? When we think about children and adults kind of recreational play, sometimes it seems to pursue victory conditions, other times it seems to have a goal or a purpose which isn't directed towards that. So I try and interrogate those questions a bit. And of course, I think it's quite interesting that a win state is usually irrelevant. What's more important is that people try to win. And so I call this phenomenon systemic iterative irresolution, that actually that's built into how military wargaming works. It creates this idea of a perpetual motion machine. When you win a game, when the game is over, when you lose a game, that's not the end of the story. It just moves us on to the next game, to the next iteration, and so on. I also, as I say, I'm very interested in this question of immersion. So I think about the way in which this spell of immersion is cast in games, and what the politics of the kind of pleasure that is generated by the experience of immersion. There's a very interesting literature on this, again, oftentimes quite theoretically dense, but it's quite interesting to think about how one's inner critic is switched off. We've all had that experience where we're playing and time passes, and somehow it's then the middle of the night and you're sitting there a bit hungry and disorientated and in need of food and water. This idea of what Simon Parkin calls chronoslip, the slippage of time, seems to occur. But the pleasure of immersion has to do, I think, with this idea of a feedback loop of cause and effect. You have this symbiosis of action and reaction. And of course, according to the community of practice, at least some of them, you need to be immersed for a game to be valid. But of course, the spell of immersion can be broken. And I think one of the big questions is, what are the perhaps political or kind of critical advantages to punctuating immersion with critical reflection? As we know, when immersion is broken, we oftentimes bump back to reality with something of a bump. And as we know, Csikszentmihalyi, you know that you've been studying wargames a long time when you learn how to pronounce his name, but offered a theorization of flow, not the same as, but related to immersion. And he says that flow is an optimal state of consciousness, a peak state where we both feel and perform our best. We become so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Your whole being is involved and you're using your skills to the utmost. So, I mean, I make a distinction in the book between immersion and flow. I think immersion is much more of this kind of hazy, dreamy sense of being lost, whereas flow actually has to do with a very intense form of focus. I'm just seeing there's a question in the chat. For the win, isn't that dependent on winning, losing being relevant to the use of wargaming in the specific context being examined? Analytical wargames don't need win losers. MDMT gaming is about comparing COAs and not winning losing. I think that's absolutely fair, and thanks for pointing it out. I think what I mean by winning and losing doesn't have to simply mean a kind of clear win state. I think, and I talk about this in the beginning of the book, one of the things that distinguishes games from simulations is the idea of competition, right? That you have to be trying in some way to overcome or to compete with or deal with someone or something else which is trying to restrict or trying to subvert your own action. So in that sense, I don't think there needs to be clear win-loss states, but there needs to be a kind of pursuit of some sort of condition. Now, that condition might be simply not losing. It might be simply doing better than you did last time. I think with things like analytical wargames, you don't need win-loss outcomes, but you do need players to invest. And the ways that players are encouraged to invest more often than not, I think, has to do with the pursuit of some end state. But I'm very happy to talk more about that. I'm very happy to hear more about your thoughts on that one. I think there's another, yeah, thanks for the distinction between games and Sims banging that drum for a long time. It is, I mean, as I said before, it's been very interesting to see how entrenched some of the assumptions and different uses of vocabulary are here. So I hope, a rather basic contribution that the book can make is maybe just to try and get people to reflect on how they're using those terms, and whether, one of the big problems, Ellie Bartels was talking to me about this recently, that when we read about war games in the press, it's almost never war games that actually are being described, right? It's usually exercises. It's, war games between X power and X power, having this diplomatic effect or this consequence raising tensions. But these are almost always training exercises that are done out in the field, which are actually very different to war games as we understand them. So I, again, try and clarify that. So let me just start to wrap up and say a few more things about immersion before we turn it over to Q&A. So I draw on a theory of pedagogy, Brazilian pedagogy theorist Paulo Freire, who has talked about this idea of immersion being a non-reflexive state. He talks about the ways in which animals do not consider the world, they are immersed in it. And this got me thinking about where do we go when we are immersed? Where do our critical thinking faculties go? We know when we play that we become very focused, we become very engaged with the game's goals. And does that mean that immersion actually sits in tension with reflexivity? The more immersed we are, the less we are thinking about what we're doing. And this leads to a rather unsettling possibility. If we become passive in our gameplay, do we become really the object of the game rather than its active subject? This takes us back to our friend Gadamer that somebody was mentioning before. Peter was talking about his trauma. I hope that trauma has recovered. Gadamer emphasizes this question of agency. He doesn't use the word, but he thinks about the kind of question of who is in control in the context of a game, who is the subject and who is the object. And this quote really stuck with me. I think it's one of the most kind of insightful, one of the things we have to think really hard about when we think about the politics and power relations of gaming. He says the following: all playing is a being played. The attraction of a game, the fascination it exerts, consists precisely in the fact that the game masters the players. The real subject of the game is not the player, but instead the game itself. What holds the player in its spell, draws him into play and keeps him there, is the game itself. Now, this, of course, is very challenging. It really turns on its head our conventional assumptions about who has agency, who is in control, who is the originator, who is the subject of the playing or the gameplay experience. According to Gadamer, it's not us as player subjects, but rather the power lies with the game. The game turns us into what it wants for its own purposes. Now, if that's the case, I think we need to think about the politics of immersion, the politics of becoming a passive object in the game. How can we reclaim more of an active subjectivity? How can we become more active game players so that we think about ourselves in an at play, think about what we're doing reflexively rather than simply pursuing what the game incentivizes us to do? My wager here is that we should go ahead and break the spell of immersion. We should think about the ways in which, if we are becoming the object of the game, we need to take steps to become active reflexive subjects again. While it might be efficacious from a military training point of view to become more passive to the game's sort of objectives, it is problematic from the point of view of agency and the point of view of pedagogical theory. So how do we avoid becoming the passive objects of gameplay? My solution to this is that really we should prioritize play over game. You'll see now why I've been talking about play for so many chapters of the book. Game, as I said before, is a structure that kind of contains, directs, and arrests play. So what we should do then is introduce more play into our games, into our interactions with games. We should play the games playfully. We should game the game. We should do what people often say we ought not to do, and we should fight the scenario. We should push it at its limits, at its assumptions, at its coded in hierarchies and the power relations at work. So to that extent, I wager it matters much less what we play. I'm not interested in saying certain forms of games are good or bad, or sort of pearl clutching responses to video game violence or anything like that. I'm much more interested in how we play. How do we cultivate active, critically astute, and reflexive game player subjects? And this is where I kind of coined the idea of deconstructive play, drawing on the thought of Jacques Derrida. For Derrida, he talks about a mode of thinking that he calls deconstruction, and he actually links that quite closely to play. He says that actually this mode of thinking really functions as a form of play. So what I try and do in deconstructive play is basically take some of what I think is interesting about Dionysian play, free play, this idea of process over order and subjectivities as kind of being generated, but also move away from the kind of hero warrior subject at work in Nietzsche's kind of manifestation of the Dionysian. So we're trying to think about how we can cultivate ourselves as players who are interested in exposing power relations, norms, hierarchies, and so on that are coded into games and into our player subjects. And this simply has to do with asking critical questions. How do we keep the play in play? How do we interrogate what a game is about? Well, my understanding really of a game is that it is a text. It is a communication device, a non-linear communication device. But nevertheless, it is a communication device. It's a popular cultural artifact which can be read. We can read it critically. We can ask, what are its rules? What is the story being told and from whose perspective? Who are its heroes and villains? What acts am I being rewarded or punished for? What are the gendered, racialized, and colonial tropes at work? What kinds of modding or hacking or counterlegic identities might we bring in? So I'll finish off just with a little kind of typology that I've developed, which breaks down this idea of deconstructive play. It basically argues that there are some sort of exciting and generative elements of the Dionysian that I think we should keep and build upon, but it brings into this idea of you know, the sense of auto-critique, auto-deconstruction, if you will. At the moment, I would say a lot of play that is done in and around the military sort of links more closely to the Apollonian tradition. It has to do with kind of, it's towards directed ends. It has to do with kind of particular forms of learning. And I think it would behoove us within and beyond the military to introduce more kind of creative play in different ways as we think about the place of games and play in our political and social and military lives. I think I will stop there. Very happy to turn it over to you guys now. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure to present this material to you.
So as I wait for other people to put some questions in the chat, I wanted to ask, so what was your approach when you were doing your research for your book?
Approach in what sense? Sorry, for the empirical stuff or?
Either, like, you know, I mean, one is like sort of what was the methodology approach that you sort of employed to, you know, wrestle with this very big and sort of amorphous problem set, and what can you share about what you learned during that process?
Thanks. I mean, it's a great question. So this really started off kind of, as I say, in 2017 or so, and it grew out of a kind of existing interest in games. I mean, my work previously had been on the invasion of Iraq, on the neoconservative movement. It hadn't really been about games or play at all. It had been about US foreign policy and IR theory. And what happened was I started going along to conventions, to connections, to other kind of wargaming conventions. And I started just kind of doing background reading. And I thought, you know, this is so relevant for international relations and global politics. Why, you know, surely there must be a great big literature out there on this. But there wasn't. And I kept digging and kept looking. And I started asking people at the conventions, you know, what research could they recommend, and so on. And they said, you know, there does seem to be quite a big kind of gap here. So that was the first kind of step where you identify that gap in the literature and you think, right, okay, you know, there's an opportunity here. What I then started doing methodologically was hitting the books as usual and doing the background research, but I actually started interviewing as quickly as possible, because really what I was learning was that there wasn't a huge amount written down, but there was a huge amount of professional expertise, and people were really happy to discuss that. So I devised a kind of research ethics application, put that into my former institution, and then when I joined King's, submitted a separate one for that, and just began interviewing people. So and that was a real relief, right? Because as someone who had, you know, done their PhD, you know, really sitting in dusty libraries, you know, falling asleep on books, it was really fantastic to realize that you can actually generate scholarly data through interacting with people, through talking to people. So I conducted 4 fieldwork trips. I went across to the East Coast and drove around from North Carolina through Virginia up to New York and DC, up to Boston. I went to some command post exercises at Joint Base Lewis McCord. I went to some Connections UK and US events. Went out to Sweden to the Viking exercise out there. So yeah, it was a kind of hands-on, practical fieldwork kind of methodological approach. And then of course there was all the deep dive theory stuff, which really can only take place under a pile of books with a lot of coffee.
So we have a question that says, how does your conclusion relate to trauma in drone attacks pilots and David Grossman's earlier research on first-person shooter games objectifying targets?
I mean, it's been a fascinating series of events right recently. I was actually out in Australia conducting field work recently, and it was like some of the recent disclosures that were happening and the controversies that were happening around disclosures and online and in terms of drone related stuff. I was just going to say, if people want to pop their cameras on, I don't know if that's okay with you, Sebastian, but it'd be very nice to be able to interact and see people's faces if we've stopped recording. That would be very cool.
Yeah, 1 second. So for those who are watching us on YouTube, the Q&A session was on video and audio, so we did not record it to respect people's privacy because this is recorded for our YouTube channel. But if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to our speaker directly. And I believe they can find you on the King's website, right?
That's correct, yes. You can email me at aggie.hirst@kcl.ac.uk, or if you just throw my name into Google, it's an unusual enough one that you will find my information very easily. So on the King's page or other links to my work.
Perfect. And I would like to say on behalf of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, it was a pleasure to have you talk about concepts of play and sort of how it is used in the professional military from a scholarly point of view. And hopefully we'll have you back when you continue your research in the field. Thank you. I would be delighted to come back. Thank you for great attendance. Thank you for great questions and for coming along, giving up your lunchtime period for that. It's the end of the day here in the UK, so I will begin to wrap up. I should also mention before I jump off, we are about to run Wargaming Week. If people aren't aware of the King's Wargaming Network, you can find the information for that online as well. The network is run out of King's, but we have a great many partners and a great many activities, online resources, lectures and events and so on. Wargaming Week runs 28th of May through to, was that right? I'll check my calendar. Sorry, 30th of May through to June 2nd. It will be held at King's College. Anyone who happens to be in the UK at that time is very welcome to take part, but you can follow all the activities online as well. So thanks very much and stay in touch. I appreciate it. Thank you.